He was a man of God, devoted to saving souls from darkness. She believed she was darkness itself, a demon beyond redemption. But when Pastor Samuel tried to exorcise her demons, he discovered something that would shatter his faith and change his life forever. What he found wasn't evil. It was a truth so powerful it made him question everything he thought he knew about God. Pastor Samuel Cross stood 6 feet tall with kind brown eyes and graying temples that gave him a distinguished, trustworthy appearance. At 45, he had spent 20 years building Riverside Community Church from a small congregation of 12 to over 800 members. He was known throughout the town of Cedar Falls as a pillar of faith, a man who could quote scripture from memory, whose sermons brought people to tears, and whose unwavering belief in God's love had helped countless souls find their way to salvation. Samuel lived alone in the modest parsonage behind the church, having never married, dedicating his entire life to serving God and his community. Raven Blackwood was everything Samuel's congregation would consider lost. At 28, she had jet black hair that fell in wild waves around her pale, angular face, and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of pain no young woman should ever know. Her arms were covered in intricate tattoos that told stories of darkness, demons, skulls, and gothic imagery that made churchgoers cross themselves when they saw her. She dressed in black leather and torn clothing, her lips painted dark crimson, and she carried herself with the defiant posture of someone who had given up on redemption long ago. Most people in Cedar Falls crossed the street when they saw her coming, whispering about the devil girl who lived in the abandoned warehouse on the wrong side of town. The incident that would change both their lives happened on a stormy Tuesday night in October. Samuel was working late in his office, preparing Sunday's sermon about God's infinite mercy, when he heard frantic pounding on the church doors. Through the rain-streaked windows, he could see a figure collapse on the front steps, and despite the late hour and the dangerous neighborhood reputation, his pastoral instincts kicked in. When he opened the door, Raven stumbled inside, soaking wet and shaking violently. But it wasn't from the cold. Her eyes were wild with terror, and she kept looking over her shoulder as if something was chasing her. "Please," she gasped, clutching at Samuel's shirt with trembling hands. "You have to help me. I can't control it anymore. The darkness, it's getting stronger. I think I'm becoming what everyone says I am. I think I really am a demon." Most pastors might have been frightened or suspicious, but Samuel saw something in her eyes that his 20 years of ministry had taught him to recognize: genuine spiritual anguish. This wasn't attention-seeking or mental illness. This was a soul in crisis, crying out for salvation. "I've heard about your work," Raven continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "People say you can save anyone, but I don't think even God can save someone like me. I've done things, terrible things. I hurt people just by being near them. Everyone I've ever cared about gets destroyed. My own family disowned me when I was 16 because strange things started happening around me. Maybe they were right. Maybe I am cursed." Samuel's approach to helping Raven was a manipulation. It was genuine compassion mixed with unwavering faith. Over the following weeks, he convinced her to meet with him regularly for what he called spiritual counseling. 3 times a week, Raven would come to the church after hours, when the congregation wouldn't see her, and judge either of them for this unconventional ministry. Samuel treated her not as a project to be fixed, but as a person to be understood. He brought her hot coffee and homemade sandwiches, noticing she was often hungry. He listened without judgment as she told him about her childhood, how she'd been raised by a grandmother who practiced what the town called dark arts, how she discovered she had an unusual ability to sense people's hidden pain and secrets, how this gift had been twisted into something that terrified her. "When I touch someone," Raven explained during one of their sessions, "I can see all the darkness inside them, their worst memories, their deepest shames, their hidden sins. And somehow, just by knowing these things, I make them worse. People become more angry, more violent, more self-destructive after spending time with me. That's why I stay away from everyone. That's why I think I might be what they say I am." Samuel spent hours in prayer and biblical study, researching everything about spiritual gifts, demonic possession, and divine calling. He was convinced that what Raven possessed wasn't evil, but a twisted version of what the Bible called discernment of spirits, a gift that had been corrupted by years of fear and isolation. The turning point came during their 6th week of meetings. Samuel had decided to attempt what he believed would be a healing prayer session, laying hands on Raven to cast out whatever demonic influence he thought might be tormenting her. He had prepared with fasting and prayer, certain that his faith would be strong enough to save her. But the moment Samuel placed his hands on Raven's shoulders and began to pray, something unexpected happened. Instead of peace and healing, Samuel was suddenly flooded with visions. Not demons or evil, but divine truth that was almost too overwhelming to bear. He saw Raven's true nature. She wasn't cursed or demonic. She was what ancient texts called a burden bearer, someone chosen by God to carry the pain and darkness of others so they could be healed. Her gift wasn't to destroy, but to absorb suffering. Every person she had made worse had actually been purged of their deepest pain, which she then carried within herself like a spiritual sponge. But the most shattering revelation was what Samuel saw about himself and his ministry. He witnessed 20 years of his own spiritual pride, his subtle manipulation of his congregation's emotions, his use of their vulnerabilities to build his own reputation as a great man of God. He saw how his sermons had sometimes driven people to despair rather than hope, how his rigid interpretation of Scripture had driven away those who needed love most. In that moment of divine revelation, Samuel realized that Raven, the woman everyone considered a demon, was actually closer to Christ's mission than he had ever been. She had been unknowingly sacrificing her own well-being to heal others, while he had been building a career on other people's faith. Samuel jerked his hands away from Raven as if he'd been burned, stumbling backward with tears streaming down his face. The weight of the revelation was crushing. Everything he thought he knew about good and evil, about his own righteousness and her supposed wickedness, had been turned upside down. "What did you see?" Raven asked quietly, recognizing the look of someone who had just encountered a truth too big for their understanding. "I saw." Samuel struggled to find words. "I saw that you're not the one who needs saving. I am. God, what have I been doing all these years? I've been so proud, so certain I was doing his work, but I've been building my own kingdom, not his." Raven sat in stunned silence as Samuel collapsed into a chair, his entire worldview crumbling. "You carry other people's pain," he whispered. "That's your gift. You're not a demon, you're an angel. And I've been the one spreading spiritual poison, not you." The confrontation with this truth sent Samuel into a dark night of the soul that lasted weeks. He stopped preaching, avoided his congregation, and spent days in solitary prayer and fasting. Meanwhile, Raven found herself in the strange position of comforting the man who had tried to save her. 3 months later, everything had changed. Samuel had resigned from Riverside Community Church, much to his congregation's shock and dismay. But instead of leaving ministry entirely, he had started something completely different, a small ministry for society's outcasts, meeting in the very warehouse where Raven lived. Their weekly gatherings included drug addicts, sex workers, homeless individuals, and others who had been rejected by traditional churches. Samuel's new approach to ministry was radically different. Instead of preaching at people about their sins, he listened to their pain. And Raven, no longer hiding her true nature, used her gift openly to help people confront and release their deepest traumas. The most surprising transformation was in Raven herself. As she learned to embrace her gift as divine calling rather than curse, the darkness that had surrounded her began to transform into light. She still dressed in black, still looked unconventional, but there was a peace in her eyes that hadn't been there before. People stopped crossing the street when they saw her. Instead, they sought her out, somehow sensing that she could help them carry burdens they couldn't bear alone. Samuel and Raven never became romantically involved, but they became spiritual partners in the truest sense. Two people who had found their authentic calling by helping each other see past the lies they had believed about themselves. The warehouse ministry grew slowly but steadily, attracting people who had been wounded by traditional religion or society's judgment. Samuel learned to preach not from a position of spiritual superiority, but from shared brokenness and the hope of redemption that comes through honest community rather than perfect doctrine. Sometimes the people we think need saving the most are actually the ones called to save us. And sometimes the greatest crisis of faith leads not to the loss of God, but to finding Him in places we were too proud or too frightened to look before. True ministry isn't about converting people to our way of thinking. It's about allowing God to convert us through the people He places in our path, especially the ones who make us uncomfortable with our assumptions about holiness and redemption.